So we're going to move on to the next session. So I'd like to welcome John McLean, who's head of the Hampden Clinic in Glasgow, and everyone will know him for being long-standing head of medicine at Scottish Football, and Professor Carolyn Emery, who's professor in Calgary and leads the IOC Centre in Calgary. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start our concussion session and hopefully keep going with the fantastic quality of the meeting that we've had. As Ian's introduced Caroline, I had the pleasure of having dinner with Caroline last night, and we had a fantastic discussion over concussion and concussion management. She's one of the go-to people in the world to talk about concussion, particularly concussion prevention. So, Caroline, we look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thanks so much, and thank you also for slowing down your speech last night too, so I could follow your accent. I know I'm the one with the accent, but really enjoyable evening. Lots of conversation about concussion. Thank you to Ian and the organizing committee for inviting us to have a concussion session and to speak here today. So I think this is the one I'm using. Yeah. So I'm going to focus upstream, where I do most of my work as an injury epidemiologist and physiotherapist, on the prevention of concussions, and give quite a few examples from youth in particularly grassroots sport. Call my program Shred Concussions, and it stands for Surveillance in High Schools and Community Sport to Reduce Concussions and Their Consequences. I have peer review funding from a number of sources, and I sit on a couple of scientific committees, but no conflicts for my talk today. So this is from the 5th consensus on concussion in sport. I'm sure many of you are familiar and have been waiting with bated breath for the 6th consensus to come out, which I understand from a text about 20 seconds ago that we expect that on June the 14th. So I won't get into this definition too much. It will be a little bit different in a couple of weeks. So, but I just did want to highlight, I know we have some other presentations that'll get more specific in this session around diagnostics. So as I say, we look forward to the results from Amsterdam, 11 systematic reviews, and I had the privilege of leading the prevention systematic review in this context, and they will all be published alongside the consensus. So please make sure you read the systematic reviews as well, that will bring the latest evidence that informed that consensus document. So this is in Calgary, in Edinburgh, different sport priorities certainly, but lots of opportunity for high-risk concussion sports where we see high rates of participation. And in both contexts, this is where many of us who do work in prevention focus on the high risk concussion sports where we see high participation rates and can have the greatest public health impact upstream in primary prevention. So in my part of the world, we expect 1 in every 9 youth between 11 and 18 in Canada to sustain a sport-related concussion each year. 60% of these of all concussions in youth are sport-related, and 30% are recurrent, and about 30% of kids are symptomatic for months. So this gives us opportunity not just for primary prevention, but also secondary prevention of recurrent concussion, as well as long-term consequences of concussion. So where are we seeing these concussions occur? Across the globe, we see the highest rates in rugby, and then ice hockey, American football, lacrosse, and soccer or youth football. We do rely on validated concussion surveillance to be able to evaluate prevention strategies. So I just want to highlight that here. We do surveillance in the context of research, not just to collect the frequency of concussion and other injury, but also to understand risk factors. So we measure a number of things often at baseline and throughout the season for kids where we see changes through growth and development. We collect very precise information on all injury as well as concussion. And in our surveillance system, we have sport medicine physicians who are involved as part of the study across multiple clinics across Canada, actually, who are harmonized in their diagnosis and follow-up. And this is really important that kids are getting in to see physicians in our study within 72 hours of sustaining a suspected concussion. That information in the surveillance goes back to the physician and other clinicians that are working with the adolescent, in this case, to inform return to play and return to school, as well as to our sports stakeholders who are making decisions about best practice and policy in this context in the prevention of concussion. This is our web-based portal, which we call Shred Concussions, which is a portal which is friendly for kids and parents to enter data, as well as the back end for clinicians and study personnel to also enter data across a number of different contexts. We use surveillance to understand the extent of an injury problem. Here's an example from high school rugby, which Dr. Stephen West is involved with this study. You'll hear from him later. And what we found over 2 seasons of play in high school rugby is that this is a very high-risk concussion sport. For boys, the rates were 22 concussions per 1,000 match hours, and for girls, even higher, 37.5 concussions per 1,000 match hours. To put this into context with the rest of the literature, which is focused very much on elite and professional rugby, where we're seeing rates between 10 and 20. So this was a really big public health concern in Canada, particularly for girls. And over 40% of all injuries in this sport in high school are concussion. From our last consensus, we had some clear evidence-informed prevention strategies that were body checking in youth ice hockey, which I'll give a little bit of a background to follow, and as well as helmets in skiing and snowboarding to reduce the risk of concussion. Future research was needed around mouth guards as a protective effect in collision sport, head contact rules, helmet fit and headgear, restricting contact practice, and training strategies. I wish I could share with you the details of the 6th consensus prevention review today, but I cannot do that. But what I can do is to say we've come a long way. We have 4 times as many studies as we were able to report on in the last consensus. Unfortunately, we're not doing any better in terms of the female-focused studies. We're still at about 2%. We need more work in this area. We need to fill this gap, in particular, the gender gap in this research. But in 2 weeks, I hope you'll all take time to read that review. So when we look at targets for prevention, we look across rule changes or policy, equipment, personal protective equipment, as well as training strategies. So I'm going to give you some examples from our research in these domains. So we've been doing work in ice hockey for many years, youth ice hockey in Canada, because this is where we see very high participation rates and very high concussion rates. Historically, in 11 and 12-year-old leagues, which were called Pee-wee at the time, we saw a 4-fold higher rate of concussion just because those kids are playing in Alberta versus another province called Quebec, because those kids in 11 and 12-year-old leagues in Alberta were exposed to rules that allowed body checking in games. And the body check is synonymous to the tackle in rugby. And the force is typically in the opposite direction to really remove the player from forward progress with the puck. So this was a significant difference compared to a province where body checking was not allowed in games. This led to quite a bit of discussion, quite a bit of media attention. We met with all of the ice hockey organizations across provinces, locally, as well as Hockey Canada. And this evidence across a number of cohort studies supported delaying body checking to an older age group, 13 and 14-year-olds. So then we were able to prospectively evaluate that policy change, and what we saw specifically related to concussion was a 64% reduction in concussion rates following that policy change. Where body checking is disallowed in games, we still certainly do develop the skill, which is going to be needed at a more elite level of play. And if we translate this to the impact, we save over 6,000 injuries and over 4,800 concussions in 11 and 12-year-old leagues alone each year in Canada. This then translated to further policy change in older age groups, so 13 to 17-year-olds. This is from our under 18 age group, where we see a policy change disallowing body checking in non-elite levels of play. This is still 60 to 70% of kids who play at this age group. And what we saw, 51% reduction in concussion, specifically in this older age group as well, translating also to a significant impact nationally, where body checking is no longer allowed in non-elite levels of play in adolescent ice hockey leagues. The concern is around, in the community, unintended consequences. So if you delay body checking in games, will kids then be at a higher risk of concussion in older age groups when they're now exposed to body checking? And in fact, what we show is those kids in the 15 to 17-year-old age group who have had more exposure to body checking in previous years are actually at a higher rate of injury and concussion. And this is from Dr. Paul Lyson's work, who's a postdoc at the University of Calgary. So really no evidence for unintended consequences. So we'll move to an example around equipment, personal protective equipment or mouth guards. So this work here is specifically in youth ice hockey. So we can only translate this to discussion around youth ice hockey, but to show that in a nested case controlled study within a large cohort over 5 years of play, we see a significantly lower odds of concussion in those kids who wore a mouth guard. And our controls are kids who sustained a musculoskeletal injury, and so we're able to do this through a nested case control. Ash Kolstad, a PhD student in our lab, has now done a prospective cohort study and is also able to show a significant reduction, and this is now through incidence rate ratios, showing a 34% reduction in concussion rates in those kids who are wearing mouth guards. Moving on to a training strategy. People are very familiar with neuromuscular training warm-ups. We've been doing work in this area for a very long time. It's informed the IOC consensus on the developing youth athlete, a number of randomized control trials and many more since that time, showing a protective effect, particularly for lower extremity injury. These are some of the components included in neuromuscular training, with an increased emphasis in the last several years on some concussion-specific components. And some of you will know Catherine Schneider, and she's really leading a lot of this development based on work that she's done in rehabilitation following concussion, so through her cervical-vestibular work. So adding those components of sensory motor control, neck control, and endurance will hopefully support an impact on reduction of concussion as well as other injuries. We went back to one of our first trials in soccer and actually pulled out the data on concussion. We see a point estimate that suggests a 72% lower rate of concussion, not statistically significant in this sport, in this particular randomized controlled trial, but certainly evidence to support a potential clinically relevant reduction in concussion rates, so certainly more work needs to be done. And then in this country, led out of the University of Bath, Mike Hislop's work first evaluating Activate, and which had some component of neck strengthening, but also all of the other components which may have an impact in reducing concussion, such as balance and agility. And in this study demonstrates in schoolboy rugby a 59% reduction in concussion when the program is done at least 3 times per week. This is Isla Schill. She's a PhD student in our program, and she's moving forward with a very specific, context-specific Canadian rugby neuromuscular training warm-up. Our season is quite a bit shorter. We work with a number of different organizations to co-design this, including those who developed Activate, and that study is ongoing right now. I think it's really important that we look at multidisciplinary collaboration. We need strong concussion surveillance to be able to evaluate concussion prevention in sport at all levels. Head impact biomechanics work is helping us using instrumented mouth guards, hopefully to better understand mechanisms as well as head impacts in certain sports. And then as well combining that with video analysis, and I think Stephen's going to talk a little bit more about that. But that multifaceted approach is really important. That requires multidisciplinary expertise. So Stephen is actually leading a World Rugby study that's focused on the girls' game, along with Isla Schill, and they're really combining a multifaceted approach, thinking about neuromuscular training, tackle training, rule changes, such as change in the tackle height, as well as protective equipment to be able to hopefully combined have the greatest impact in reducing the concussion risk, particularly on the girls' side of the game. I think this is a really exciting study and opportunity actually for us to work together across Canada as well as sites in the UK. So with regards to the training, I think that once we have evidence, it's really important to be thinking about the implementation, and it's around behavior change for athletes and for coaches. And I think it's really important that when we have evidence that we translate that and scale that up. And so we've developed a workshop that is being translated across multiple communities, not just in urban, but also to rural communities, and working with Indigenous community partners, as well as having, of course, the resources available freely to people on the internet. So this has been quite successful in scaling up. We use our Shredmobile, which is our mobile unit that helps us to get our research program out to rural communities and Indigenous communities, and as well to be able to partner that with clinical initiatives as well as education initiatives around concussion. And maybe one day you will have a Shredmobile here in the UK as well. So really, just to sum up, I think that we need to make sure that we're thinking about primary prevention, even as clinicians. What can we do to support the prevention of concussion in the first place? The best concussion, of course, is the one that never happens. We need validated injury surveillance to do that. Hopefully, we can partner that with other modalities such as video analysis and head impact biomechanics. And to scale up the implementation and evaluation as we do scale up some of these initiatives for prevention. That takes transdisciplinary collaboration, and this is our goal in Alberta, to reduce concussions in youth 25% by 2025. I hope that you too have a goal here in the UK. I've had the wonderful opportunity of working with this amazing group of people to initiate the UK Concussion Prevention Network. We had our first meeting in March when I first arrived in the UK, and it's an initiative across multiple institutions with support from Love of the Game. And you probably know these two characters. One of them is going to speak later today. Just a big shout out to Keith Stokes from the University of Bath and Debbie Palmer from the University of Edinburgh, who have really hosted me the last few months here in the UK, and congratulations on your UK Collaborating Centre on Injury and Illness Prevention in Sport. I'm really excited to continue working with you within this network. Takes a whole host of people to do this kind of work and to translate this kind of work and keep these things sustainable in the community. This only happens because I have the great opportunity to work with so many amazing people back home and around the world. And these are my kids who gave me lots of opportunity to fear for significant concussion and otherwise. And I think we're going to leave questions till later. And thanks so much for that. And we're going to wrap up this session with Dr. Stephen West. He's a lecturer at the University of Bath and part of the new IOC Centre. I had the privilege of working with Stephen over in Canada for a few years, and he really is helping us to ensure that we start with prevention and we end with prevention. So thank you, Stephen.
First of all, I would just like to say thank you very much for the invite to speak. And I always feel a bit, I don't know, awkward, I guess, in a room full of clinicians, whereby if I do my job and prevent the injuries from happening, I'm putting you guys out of jobs. So it's kind of tricky in that sense. But hopefully today, as I go through, you can look at some of the examples that I'm giving and try and see for yourself how we can use a multimodal approach. And some of the examples that I give, Carolyn may have already mentioned today. But I think, again, the key thing is that we're starting to try and think about how we can stack some of these prevention strategies on top of one another so that we're not just looking at one, we're actually looking at multiple, and then also how we can evaluate these to make sure that we are having the consequences that we're hoping for. So I'm sure a lot of you will be very familiar with the Van Mechelen model. And so today I'm going to be focusing very much on steps 2 and 3 of that. So introducing a preventative measure and then assessing the effectiveness of that measure. And so, as I say, I'll give a couple of examples that have been proven to work, some of which, we need to do more work in, and we need to expand to different contexts and to different populations. And then I'll finish off by speaking about some of the evaluation methods, again, some of which you've heard about already. So just to kick off and to kind of recap, we have generally got 3 primary areas of prevention. So they are law and policy change, training strategies, and protective equipment. I'll speak probably a little bit about rugby examples because that's primarily the area that I'm working in. And I know Caroline's given a really good overview of a youth context. But one of the things that I would say is that, it doesn't matter what group of athletes you're working with, there are prevention strategies out there that work, and hopefully I'll give you a sense of some of those. So I'll speak a little bit about tackle height changes, which for anybody that knows anything about rugby is probably one of the hottest topics in the game at the moment. I'll very briefly touch on body checking policy, as Caroline's already mentioned it. And then in football, around head contact policies and trying to mitigate risk there. Training strategies, again, I'll speak a little bit about neuromuscular warm-up programs and vision training. And then from a protective equipment standpoint, again, I'll touch on some of the things that we've already spoken briefly about around mouth guards and helmets and headgear. So to kick off in terms of law and policy change, as I say, tackle height is probably the hottest topic in rugby at the moment, particularly at the community and non-professional levels. So there was a bit of work that went on a couple of years ago, and I'll talk about it a bit later, using video analysis, whereby they identified that a large number of the injuries and concussions in particular were coming from head-to-head contact between players. Now, I will caveat it by saying that largely this was done in professional males, and we're starting to look at more, wider populations across the community level and in females to make sure that these policies are going to address those needs also. But off the back of this, they implemented a rule change back in 2018, starting with professional rugby in the second tier of English rugby, the championship. And although we saw reduced head impacts and we saw a lot of things that we were hoping to see, we actually saw an increase in the rate of concussions. So that was clearly something that was not expected. And since then, the same laws have been applied in the context of the community game, so the non-elite game, in both South Africa and in France, and we're generally seeing much better outcomes. So within both of the South African study, there was no significant findings, but again, potentially a clinically meaningful 31% reduction in concussions. And in France, who put this kind of in place, not just as a trial, but across their entire game, they've seen some really, really positive findings, and we're looking forward to seeing the results of those. But early discussions have demonstrated some really good findings. And again, anybody who works with rugby will know this, that as of a month from now, the 1st of July, across all levels, except for professional, in England, there is going to be a reduction in the height of the tackle from its current level, which is the shoulder, down to what is described as the waist, so just under the sternum. And the RFU certainly took a lot of flack for making that decision, but it was very quickly supported by World Rugby, and they've now gone on to make the same recommendation to other unions, and it will be interesting to see over the next few years how different nations take that on board, and hopefully some of the evaluation strategies that I'll talk about later can help to make some informed decisions about how that goes moving forward. Again, I won't speak too much about body checking, especially with Caroline here, because she's definitely the expert on that, and having gone and worked with her for a couple of years, when I talk about hockey, we're talking about very different hockeys, so probably not a good idea for me to talk about that. But we do obviously know that there's a really good positive impact with a kind of pooled rate of 58% reduction in concussion risk, so phenomenal body of work in that area. Looking at football then, we know that increased sanctioning of and penalisation of the use of the arm while jumping in a league context has had some really positive findings also, so a 28% less head-related incidents caused by arm contact and a 29% reduction in head injuries also. So again, just starting to think about it in your own mind. What sports are you working with? What are the ones that you see on a day-to-day basis? And are there certain things that you can start to think about implementing from a law and policy change as we move forward into the next one, which is training strategies? So thinking about training strategies, again, Caroline's covered quite a bit of this already, so I won't dwell on it. 4 main components. when we look at all injury, we know that it's effective. So there's, again, a systematic review by Carolyn shows a 36% reduction in all injuries. So obviously, from that perspective, it's great. And again, this was the study that Carolyn mentioned earlier, Mike Hislop's work. And I think one of the important things to note with this one is, so Carolyn mentioned the 59% reduction when it was used 3 times a week as prescribed. The other important thing to think about is that actually, if they did it at all, even just once a week, they were seeing also a reduction of 29% in concussion risk as well. So clearly a dose effect type response here. But obviously, if we can get it done 3 times a week as advertised, then that's good. And some follow-up work in community men's players by Matt Atwood also showed very similar results. So again, demonstrating that this doesn't just apply to youth, it applies to adults also. And we are now conducting these studies, not just us in youth girls, but I know Debbie's heavily involved in some of the women's adult game to try and demonstrate the similar, hopefully, findings than what was found in the men. So really positive moving forward. And then again, thinking about something like vision training. So this was a study where they implemented both pre-season and in-season maintenance of vision training using a number of different methodologies and demonstrated really significant reductions in concussion risk, 85%. So again, starting to think about, how can I now incorporate some of the training strategies which I've talked about, or other ones that you might know about in your own sports, on top of the law changes which are often kind of governed from above. And then finally, just moving on to protective equipment. So Carolyn has already mentioned 2 of these studies, so I won't go into them. So obviously, some of the work being led from her group showing good positive reductions from a youth perspective in ice hockey. I guess my kind of thoughts on that are I absolutely would suggest doing the same. There are some studies in some sports, and again across different populations, that might suggest actually the risk isn't going down and it might actually go up. This wasn't a significant finding, but it suggested that there was an increased risk, and we've also presented some work in Amsterdam that showed similar in a professional male rugby context as well. So just to kind of say that it does look like it's protective, but there might be some contexts where maybe it doesn't. So again, going into, this is probably where we have our best evidence from a helmet perspective. So this is looking at a reduction in head and neck injuries in snow sports. So this was led by Kelly Russell, and it showed a 35% reduction in concussion risk. And I think the really important thing here is that when they looked at it in the different subpopulations, youth athletes, male athletes, and those who were just beginning for the first time were the athletes who benefited most from this particular, like using helmets. So again, there's probably subpopulations that you probably work with that might benefit here. In terms of scrum caps for rugby, despite what you might hear in marketing campaigns, there's currently no evidence to suggest that scrum caps reduce the risk of concussion. This study, which Professor Keith Stokes led, effectively showed no difference in the risk. And we've also seen from a number of studies in youth that there's no significant differences in all injury risk, head injury risk, or concussion risk while wearing headgear. And then finally, one of the other areas that's kind of been looked into further and kind of coming out of more helmeted sports is around helmet fit and helmet age. So in this particular study, they demonstrated that actually the use of helmets, or poor fitting helmets, led to more symptoms appearing and then for longer duration also. So again, with your athletes, if you're seeing them, they're playing a helmeted sport, start looking at, are they wearing a helmet that is properly fit? Is it old? Is it new? Those are certainly some of the things that you might want to consider. So moving on from there, and again, with this in the back of your mind as to how you might piece together a program for your athletes, and actually how we're going about evaluating some of these. So again, we'll touch on some of the technologies that have been mentioned already, so very much heavily based on concussion and injury epidemiology. I'll talk a bit about video analysis, and then finally some of the head impact work that's going on. So this is just some data that I published after my PhD. And so when it comes to injury epidemiology or concussion epidemiology, one of the first things we want to do is to understand how big a problem we're talking about. So here you can see along the y-axis, the higher up the y-axis, the more frequent the injury is, and along the further to the right on the x-axis, the more severe the injury is. So the injuries which are up there in the top right-hand corner, so your ankles, your shoulders, your knees, they're the ones which are your kind of high burden injuries. And what you'll see is that when it comes to concussion, although it sits above in the top 25%, it maybe doesn't stand out as much as those others. But the other thing that leading kind of prolonged surveillance allows you to do, and we've kind of seen this already, is that when we looked at concussion specifically, so going back to 2002, not long after the game was professionalized, we saw a pretty stable rate of concussion, anywhere between 4 and 5 injuries per 1,000 hours. So we've already talked and heard about all the different things that are going on at a professional level and all of the different things that changed. And so over the next couple of years, we saw this rapid increase or rapid growth in the rate of concussion. And again, this probably wasn't because the game was getting more dangerous. It was because we were better recognizing the injuries. The definition of what of concussion was changing, and all of the things that we've already spoken about were implemented. And then since about 2017, certainly in the English professional game, the rate seems to have stabilized in around between 20 and 25 per 1,000 hours. So again, quite a bit lower than some of the numbers Carolyn was talking about in youth. But again, hopefully that gives you a good representation of the importance of looking at this over long periods of time. Thinking about video analysis then, there's a couple of different ways that this has been implemented and rolled out. So lots of you will be familiar with some of this work, which has looked at the mechanisms of injury specifically. So obviously this is ACLs, not concussions, but similar work goes on. And off the back of this, we can identify certain mechanisms or certain ways that we can implement prevention strategies. This was some of the work that I mentioned earlier that has led to some of the tackle height changes. So essentially, each of these 3 studies that were led by Ross Tucker from World Rugby and Matt Cross from Premiership Rugby identified that it's conceivable that lowering the height of the tackle would basically bring the 2 players' heads out of the same airspace and hopefully reduce the risk of injury moving forward. So again, that's kind of very much a clear way that video analysis has been used to introduce and inform a prevention strategy. And then finally, one of the things that we also know, so this is some of Sharif Hendrick's work down in South Africa, players will tell you, oh yeah, I'm a great tackler, I always tackle with the best technique, and that always happens. But when you actually go and video them, and whether it be in training or in matches, what they say doesn't necessarily add up with what they do. And so it allows us to kind of assess behavior change, particularly in the context of some of these tackle height changes that are coming in rugby. So we'll be able to assess, do the rates change? Are they actually performing the tackle any differently? And then getting into the last section around head impact detection, we'll also be able to assess that. So some of the technologies that you might be familiar with were these patches that were worn behind the ear. There were a couple of problems with some of these around the movement of skin. They were very difficult to keep on at times, particularly in professional rugby where they were falling off because of the high impacts. A lot of helmets are now fitted with some kind of technology to kind of be able to real-time send the information back to the coaches on the sideline or to the medics. And then Carolyn's already kind of talked a little bit about the mouthguard side of things, but certainly this is giving us a huge amount of information, not only about the magnitude of the impacts, the frequency of the impacts, the location of the impacts, but also whether it's kind of, whether it's angular or whether it's linear accelerations as well. And so some of this work by Ben Jones and Greg Tierney, if this is an area that you're interested in going into, I'd certainly go and have a read of this, where they've kind of done a huge amount of work looking at the validity and the feasibility of some of these technologies in practice. So again, when it comes to any of these prevention strategies that we're trying to put together, the bedrock of what we do is in injury epidemiology, concussion epidemiology, to establish our rate. Obviously, trying to think about the mechanism of injury and whether behavior is changing, and finally looking at whether there's actually a reduction in the head impacts as well. So if we're seeing no real change in concussion rate, but we're seeing far fewer head impacts, those subconcussive blows, well then again, maybe there's a conversation to be had there, or vice versa, if we're seeing a reduction in the number of head impacts, but an increase in the concussion rate, which was like, as I had discussed earlier, again, there's conversations to be had there. So it's really important to get a multifaceted view of how things are going. So my 3 take-home messages, the methods that I've kind of discussed and that we're using to evaluate prevention are constantly changing. I've really just scraped the surface here, and there's probably people in the room that have far more complex and better ways to do it. And even looking at Dr. Sill's presentation, talking about the AI being able to do all the video analysis for us and be able to detect those hits. This is a space which is moving very, very quickly. Concussion is obviously very complex, and so the message, as I said at the start, was to try and piece together what does your prevention look like. So not just having one of these strategies in place, but using multiple strategies. And then finally, it doesn't matter what your role is in this room, everybody has a role to play in prevention. So it doesn't matter whether you're a parent, whether you're a coach, whether you're a surgeon, whether you're a researcher, everybody has a role here, and hopefully you'll all get on board with that prevention message. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to chatting for the rest of the day.
Now, we won't take anything away from the fact the Bath team there looked very official and the Calgary team was in a bar, but thanks so much. Thanks to all the speakers. I believe we have time for 3 questions, so please keep your questions concise. And we have a mic.
Thanks for an interesting session. I've just got a question about what do we know about the effect of tackle height reduction changes will have on other injuries that we see in these players. Clearly in the earlier sessions today we heard about how one biomechanical aspect affects another, and there's potential second and third order effects from these changes that have been made.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're currently in a phase where we're quite reliant on a couple of studies. So obviously the professional studies weren't very successful. And when we look at the community game, which is obviously the largest playing population, we are somewhat reliant on those studies from South Africa and France. Based on what we currently know, both the rates of injury have been going down, and also the players are, when we ask the players how they actually are enjoying the changes that are being made, they say the game is much better. There's obviously some knock-on consequences from the perspective of performance, and it will lead to a slightly different game. But again, some of the early suggestions from France is actually that it makes it a more free-flowing game. It's a faster game, and actually it's more positive in that sense. Now, they have had some additional changes that the RFU haven't introduced alongside theirs, around having a second tackler involved and the ball carrier not being able to duck last minute. So there are some things and there are some nuances, but I think all of the evidence currently would suggest that it will have a generally positive effect. In terms of unintended consequences and other injuries which might lead as a result, at this stage there isn't any good enough evidence to suggest that that will be the case. But I guess that kind of pulls into what Caroline was talking about earlier, that the studies on the unintended consequences of these prevention strategies will take a couple of years afterwards.
Hi, I was just wondering if you've got any reliable tools for assessing prognosis after concussion and how quickly players are going to return to play, and if there's such thing that exists.
Yeah, I wish I had that magic wand. That would be wonderful. It's interesting. The biggest collisions, the people that get knocked out, the people that have tonic posturing appear to symptomatically recover much quicker. And Tony could perhaps attest to that. I don't know why that is. I mean, it's a bit like the switch it on and switch it off when my computer doesn't work, and it seems to work, but it's really hard. One of the bigger prognostic factors is just actually their history. Those that develop prolonged symptomatology are more likely to then have a longer return in the future. So it's looking at the individual and actually looking at their prognosis is probably a better thing than any tool that would be across the board. I'm not sure if is that true, Tony?
Absolutely. No, you're completely right. So I mean, we're really not there in terms of prognostication with any tools yet. So I think that all the modalities are discussed, I think also looking not just diagnosis, but prognosis as well. But I think you have a really strong interplay of just, what the injury, I mean, as I say, some of the most, dramatic injuries often recover really quickly. And then you have the influence of, genes, for example. This is really, really powerful. We don't know anything about that yet. I'm just talking about also TBI in general, traumatic brain injury in general. And actually, even with the best tools, we think we can only predict about a third of what's going to happen to the patient in the long term, because there's genetics, there's social factors, there's lifestyle, and also the influence of comorbidities. And I keep going on about it, but it's particularly mental health, and people with certain comorbidities tend to do a lot worse. But if you're trying to get that from an objective measures, that often that's not captured at all. So you have to look at everything, I think.
One more quick question at the back there.
Thank you very much. Firstly, really enjoyed the presentation. In terms of my questions actually been partly answered, it was around, it's really fascinating to see the kind of range of on-field monitoring that we have. And my question was kind of your opinion on the kind of potential of off-field monitoring, and if that's a kind of a growth area from your perspective. So specifically, after the concussion occurs, the range of technologies or biomarkers that we have, is that kind of a future focus? Obviously, there's a lot of work already ongoing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we find is actually that everybody's looking for, sort of the holy grail being an on-pitch, on-field assessment. I think that's a double-edged sword as well, because I think if you're looking for that, you're really looking to return a player to play effectively, if you're looking for that. And that may be the wrong question to ask, because actually, if in doubt, say the mouse, it should be the main message for everyone. And also we found the post-match assessments tend to be a lot more reliable for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously not done in a rush, but you have access to a lot of other modalities. And the best time for that, in our study, seems to be immediately after the match. But it depends what you're actually utilizing. It could be a clinic assessment 2-3 days later may offer different perspective. Some of the early biomarkers may have petered out by then, but some of the signs and the signals should still be there, a few days later, but probably looking at different things. And I said before, the timing is really, really important. So, yeah, I mean, everybody keeps on about, this kind of on-field assessment, and I think it's important. But if we're asking that with a view to returning a player to play where, some doubt exists, maybe we are asking the wrong question there.
All right, I think we need to wrap up this session, so it's been a pleasure. I think the speakers will stay up here if you have any questions for us, and I think we have a short break right now.
Good, welcome back to the last session of the day. We have some great speakers to finish off and keep us going before we head for dinner. So very briefly, Dr. Andrew Murray has been a friend and colleague for a number of years. Andrew's a sport and exercise medicine consultant, one of the few that we managed to get trained in Scotland while Professor Sir Harry Burns was our CMO. Andrew also worked with Scottish Government as a fellow for a year in public health and has worked with WHO and IOC. And in sport, he's worked in rugby, football, multiple sports, and is currently the medical director for the European Tour Golf. So, Andrew, welcome.
Thanks so much for that very kind introduction, John. My name's Debbie Palmer. Nice to meet you all. So I'm presenting on musculoskeletal injuries in golf, and this is also my disclosure statement. These are the various organisations that I serve and represent. Much of this information has also been from Patrick Robinson's PhD, which he shortly defends, so thank you for that, Paddy. Also, so our next speakers are talking about the Olympics. Debbie Palmer, Lars Engebretsen, obviously global experts in injury prevention, injury treatment, and all of these sort of things. But golf is one of the new Olympic sports. It's a sport that is synonymous with Scotland, so hopefully this provides a bit of a taste of Scotland as well as a segue into the Olympics. Scotland is the home of golf. This is the 150th Open Championship St Andrews, attended by 265,000 people over the course of the 4 championship days as well. And what we had was Roald Barr was generous with his time and has attended a number of the golf events and given us some insights as to what we should be looking at in golf. And the 4 main areas that we're looking at are physical activity for health. We know that golf can provide health-enhancing physical activity, as can sport. We can all promote it. Our golfers are also interested in what can hit the ball further or closer to the hole. And that goes for the 60-odd million people that play globally as well as the elite professionals. We all want to get better at what we do. Inclusion and diversity, incredibly important for golf as well as all sports as well. But injury prevention and injury treatment are things that we don't really know enough about and are looking to make a difference there. So thank you again to the IOC for their leadership in supporting sports to try and take steps in looking at methods for reporting and recording illness and injuries in sport as well. And thanks also to the likes of Roald and for Ben Clarson for helping us to produce a golf-specific consensus and looking at some of the things that are particular to golf. So what about golf? Who knows what injuries you might get playing golf? Can you all stand up, please? For all of you that are not too close to people, let's take 3 swings. Four. So some surprisingly beautiful and graceful swings there. You lot will fit into the professional cohort. Others, not so much. I see some elbow injuries, I see some head injuries, but again, good to actually try all of these different sports for ourselves. The thing is that amateur and professional injuries are completely different. What we do see is that amateur injuries tend to affect the lumbar spine, which is common to the professionals, but the second most common injury in amateurs is the elbow injury as well. Most musculoskeletal injuries in amateurs are actually acquired playing other sports or in other activities of daily life. We know that golf is a sport that's played by people that are 3 to 103. But again, many of the people that play golf are also older adults who may have pre-existing knee arthritis, hip arthritis, all these other things as well, or could pick up injuries in other mechanisms as well. But those that are related to golf appear to be most concentrated in the lumbar spine, the elbow in amateurs. While if you look at the professional athletes that are hitting on average 2,000 balls per week, are doing all sorts of strength and conditioning and various other things as well, the most common injuries we see in that cohort are lumbar spine, cervical injuries and complaints of neck pain, and also in the hand and wrist, which is the joint that typically golfers complain most of, particularly when it's hot and the ground is hard and they're trying to take divots out of firm turf. So what of the evidence? The systematic review and meta-analysis that's currently in press has looked at injuries in both of these cohorts and found that lower back is the factor that unites both of these cohorts. So lower back injuries are common in amateurs and professional athletes, and hand and wrist issues are those that affect the elite professional golfers the most. Well, again, it's elbows in the amateur golfers. This looked in a bit more detail at a systematic review of professional athletes. It shows you again, it's mostly spinal problems here. Lumbar spine, cervical spine, and then hand and wrist and shoulders are the things that affect golfers. And in the professionals, they're all pretty boring, let's be honest. Injuries are fairly predictable. I'm looking at a few golf colleagues in the audience here. So you can tell by how a player swings what injuries are most likely to get injured. So for example, in a right-handed golfer, if you look at the wrist, then most of the injuries are going to come at the back of the wrist due to the fact that they're going into extension with that wrist. Well, this wrist, so the lead wrist in a right-handed golfer, typically will be in that position, so radial deviation at the top of the backswing, and ulnar deviation when they're coming down and impacting through the ball. So that's the sort of pattern of injury that we see. And similar in shoulders, if you're looking at the left shoulder, you're more likely to get AC joint issues in the lead shoulder. Some data from Len Funk has shown. In your right shoulder, again, there's more in terms of anterior instability issues with the rotator cuff, etc. So again, golf medicine is interesting, but it's also reasonably predictable in the professionals, which is helpful. So you can see, again, you do get these injuries that we do expect. You can get back injuries, you can get wrist injuries, but you also can get injuries in the professionals that are unrelated to golf as well. So what about some of the research that we've done on the DP World Tour and the European Tour, looking at the prevalence, the variety and the impact of research here? Roger Hawkes was a fantastic Chief Medical and Scientific Officer for many years that has really developed this area. They looked and again found that wrist injuries are extremely common in our golfers, particularly at certain times of the year when the turf is firmer or where there's an increased volume of practice. And ulnar-sided wrist pathology is far more common in the lead wrist than it is in the trail wrist, and that essentially almost 50% of, or even more than 50% of pathology that could be demonstrated by the sports physicians, the physiotherapists or radiologists that we have on site, hand and wrist experts, was to the ECU and that complex there. So injuries that we're currently seeing at present, wrist injuries. We do have the benefit of having on-site diagnostic ultrasound, which can show synovitis in the back of wrist. Again, almost all of these are in the trail wrist of a right-handed golfer. In the trail wrist of the golfer, be that the right wrist in a right-handed golfer, the left wrist in a left-handed golfer. And you can just tell that as the mechanism either when they're actually just at the top of the backswing or when they're coming into the ball and compressing it there. Extensor carpi ulnaris. This is a structure that can be injured in many sports, particularly in rugby and in tennis as well. I know our colleagues have looked at this in some detail. But some of the injuries that you can see might be tenosynovitis. It might be tendinopathy, ECU. But you can also see sometimes an acute subluxation, particularly if someone hits something that they don't wish to, for example, a tree root or a stone or something similar. Thank you to Yuri Dvorak for this slide. This just shows that essentially the lumbar spine is commonly affected in golfers, and some of that may be due to the volume of repetitive practice, some of it may be due to the specific swim mechanics, which can be a contributor to injury, where you get this rotation, this axial load, and the various other rotational forces that can affect a golfer. And again, this pattern can be quite different in amateurs to professional as well. And we see commonly that in professional golfers, most of the injuries are right-sided and central. In amateurs, it's a slightly different pattern. So you can see when people are asked what they think has caused their injury, amateurs will often say that they think it's due to overuse in swing mechanics. And they can be contributors as well. And there is a general trend towards higher injury incidences in lower handicap golfers, i.e. those that are better at golf tend to get more injured, which may be because they play more. This work that has looked at golfers in America, there's similar work in Switzerland and Ireland that's ongoing, has shown that essentially a good number of people at any one point in time are complaining of musculoskeletal complaints when they're playing golf. What we also know is that the incidence of injury per hour played is overall low, and actually golf-related planes are quite similar to those that they complain of in everyday life. In this particular cohort, lower back injuries were common, knee injuries were prevalent, and actually elbow injuries were less common in that cohort. Another common question that we get asked in our clinic is people that have got knee arthritis, shoulder arthritis, hip arthritis, and the difference that a joint replacement can make. And essentially, if people are at the stage that they would require a joint replacement, then actually people can expect good outcomes. People with hip arthroplasty, knee arthroplasty, and shoulder arthroplasty overall can expect to get back to golf, and it tends to be a graduated approach to look to get people back out to golf on a gradual basis, perhaps starting with some chipping, some putting, some shorter shots, before going on to playing longer shots, full rounds of golf, etc. And there are these two components that joint replacements can benefit golfers with in terms of the walking component. Walking on average 6 to 7 miles when you're out in the golf course. Depends if you're any good. If you're doing this, it can take a bit longer. And of course also that rotational component as well. So what actually helps in decreasing illness and injury? Essentially a multidisciplinary approach is something that's available to the professionals, but I think physiotherapists, general practitioners, sport and exercise medicine consultants, orthopedic surgeons can all collaborate to help the community golfers to try and get back out there as well. And again, we're very lucky on tour to have MSK imaging experts that can assist us, as well as orthopedic surgeons, nutritionists, strength and conditioning, physical preparation, and various colleagues as well. So what's changing? And I guess what we know in terms of cars and in terms of golf cars is what the professional do tends to come to the amateur game after that as well. So we can see that actually the objective assessment that we perform in golfers is changing and is more in line with other Olympic sports now. You can also see that the approach to performance nutrition is completely different, and nutrition can make a very important contribution to tissue healing, also to preventing injury. And again, the players are far more cognizant of hydration, of fuel for the work that's required, and essentially also just thinking about how they can recover post their rounds, their physical preparation and the work that they would do in the gym. And it is, I mean, it sounds fairly straightforward, but it is probably a 12-hour per day job when the guys are out at a tournament. Again, you can see that there used to be far more emphasis on flexibility in golf. Now, most of the evidence will show that you get strong performance benefits in terms of strength and power and various metrics such as that as well. And actually, in terms of injury prevention, there's some tentative evidence that in golf, in keeping with many other sports, you can't go wrong getting strong, and these things are likely to decrease injury risk. Again, it's an effective warm-up, something that's a bit less, 1 or 2 stretches in the first tee. And actually, for those that are looking to get better at golf, Andrea Fradkin's work shows that if you do about a 7-minute warm-up, you're likely to take about a shot and a half off your score, as well as decreasing the risk of injury as well. And that can be a little bit of aerobic work, a little bit of stretching, and then obviously doing some actual practice shots before you hit your first ball off the first tee. What is next really is looking to get more epidemiological evidence to try and think what are the modifier risk factors and then put those things in place and study them. And I think it's also recognising that we know that injuries can be relatively common, but what is the burden? Ben Clarson's work just really highlighting that it's not just about the incidents, but it's actually what's taking people out from the activities they enjoy and they're good at for longer periods of time, and just thinking how we can put targeted risk reduction strategies in place. So we know that these things are important. We know that strength and mobility can be helpful. It is also very important to think individually with athletes and to think individually with the amateur player about their load management and about the different components of that. That might be golf, it might be physical preparation, it might be the travel demands, it might be about the different things that they've got. Again, we know that the swing can be similar in many other professionals, but there can be important differences as well in biomechanical factors. And I think Carly also talked about compliance, and this is the single most important thing, really. We know that there's so many things that work well in preventing and treating injuries in sport, but it's about just making sure the athletes do this. And we don't have as much evidence in golf, but what we do find is actually providing some support, ongoing suggestions and input to the golfers tends to keep people out there happily playing reasonable golf. And it really is about that collaboration as well. So thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this conference. Thank you again to Lars and Debbie for highlighting the opportunities for golf in relation to the other Olympic sports. And I will hand over to Carolyn.
Okay, so it gives me really great pleasure to be able to introduce Lars. So many of you will know Lars. Among many other things, Lars is co-chair of the Oslo Sports Trauma Research Centre, and for the last 16 years has been head of scientific activities at the International Olympic Committee. And he has been absolutely instrumental in driving the athlete health research agenda. Again, many of you will know Lars's very long and storied CV. But beyond this, Lars has incredible energy and passion and dedication for athlete health. And despite how busy he is, he gives his time and he makes time for people and for the things that he believes in. So today, Lars is going to be talking about protecting the health of the current athletes. Everyone, Professor Lars Engebretsen.
Thank you very much. So now when you hear about the former Olympians, when you think about that, what you should think about is how can we fix it so that we don't have total hips, total joints, total shoulders, total knees, and all of them 10 years after their career. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit here. And I'm also going to talk about what we actually do in the IOC, because you think that all we do is organize the Olympic Games. It is not true, actually, and hopefully I'll show you that one. Now, this is me. So I'm actually a clinician at heart, see patients on a daily basis now, even Olympians mostly now. I stopped operating last summer, but I have a long operating career in all kinds of joints. I started in 2007. Came from my university in Oslo, and this is what I was going to do. You can see here, you read that yourself. And since 2007, I, with other people, have built this because the IOC has generously, I should say, supported us for this. And the IOC is, as you know, the chief, Bach, up here, and then Ur Ergener, a professor from Turkey, who is heading the medical and science group of the IOC. And then this is the rest of the people, the games group, which takes care of the games, many specialties, our two secretaries, and, oops, there should be one thing coming up, and that's Richard. Are there any rovers here? Any rovers in the audience? Does anyone know who he is? Yeah, so he's a gold medal winner in the games in 1984 in LA. Yeah, and then this is the research centers. I'll speak a little bit about that because we have now 11 research centers around the world who's helping us doing the type of research we would like them to do. Now this is the medical commission, and this is what we're basically doing on a daily basis. So I live in Oslo, I commute down to Lausanne almost every other week, and I do a lot of work on the Zoom and Teams and stuff like that in addition, but this is what we're working on. What I wanted to show you first is what happens during the games, the recent games actually. And this is from, these are all the games I've done all the surveillance in. You can see since Beijing 2008, and also the youth games we are following. So we have data, but why are we doing that? Well, first I think I'm going to show you a video. Yeah, can you turn on this video, and there's some sound on the video as well? Oops. Can you? Yeah, good. Sorry. Yeah. Can you click it for me? And then put. I'm just going to show you what happens during the Olympic Games in Tokyo and in Beijing. Yeah, so this is what we prepare for. And the data to prepare for this we get from the clinic in the Olympic villages and also from the national Olympic committees. There are 206 different nations competing during the Olympic Games, Summer Olympic Games. So there's quite a few. There's 12,000 athletes. Each of them have a camp in the village, and the doctors deliver data on a daily basis to us. And here is the Tokyo data. If you just look at this one here, you can just look at this one down here. These are the different sports. Find your sport. The red one means that they're out for more than a week, and those are the most serious ones. And you can find, I think rugby is in there somewhere. That's rugby sevens, of course. That's a different sport. I know that much. But this is for the summer, and as you can see here, it's BMX is the worst part. They have serious injuries. Almost had a death in Tokyo. This is those, and here is the illnesses. Usually illnesses in regular summer games is dermatology. Sounds very strange, but this time, of course, it was more of this, COVID. So there were, in Tokyo, there were 18 cases out of 14 or 12,000 athletes for 4 weeks almost. So it's very little, very small. Not a big problem during the Tokyo Games. Here you see the summers, London, Beijing, London, Rio, and Tokyo. You can see the injuries are going down slightly, and the illnesses are gone really down. Why is that? Well, COVID made us wash hands, use face masks, not hug any longer, things like that. The question is, can we keep that up in Paris when we go there next summer? This is now from Beijing last winter. Here again, you have the sports. And here you can see something really astonishing. That is that half-pipe, big air, snowboard, slopestyle, ski slopestyle, and so forth. Freestyle skiing is very dangerous. That's where we get all the injuries. And during the games, there are about 4,000 athletes competing here in Tokyo. You can find your sport here as well. And again, there were no deaths in Beijing, but there were really serious injuries there. And sometimes they post the injuries, Facebook, social media is big. US especially, there's a US skier who broke her leg and posted this one on Facebook the next day. She is in a hospital in Beijing where they took very good care of her. Men and women, is there a difference in injuries? Actually, not much. In summer, there are some differences, but this is winter. Here you can find ski areas. There's a huge difference. And some of the skiing areas. So this is what we give to the team physicians. They know what's going on in their team. They know what they should prepare for when it comes to their athletes in that specific team, specifically in freestyle skiing. And this are the illnesses in the games, not anything serious. But in Beijing, we had 32 cases for 3 weeks. And the thing there was interesting. If you probably didn't see this, but I didn't see one Chinese volunteer. Because all of them were dressed like that. They had goggles, they had big time thing, and they were walking around like this for 3 weeks. And they didn't speak English. There was very little communication with them, they must have had a very hard time. So this was Beijing, and here you have the winter, Vancouver, Sochi, Pyeongchang, and Beijing. Again, you see that the illnesses are going down quite a bit, but the injuries are about the same. 10 to 12% are injured during the games. And these are all the Olympic Games that I've been involved in when it comes to surveillance. You see that we are doing reasonably good, but still could do better when it comes to injuries. No doubt about that. Of course, I'm not doing all this myself. We have 11 research centers around the world. The last one now, coming Edinburgh, Bath, was just received a plaque yesterday and became an official IOC research center based on applications from about 35 different centers around the world. And this time 11 centers were picked for 4 years, and they are then funded by the IOC, not so much, but some, for the 4 years. And this is what they're doing. Instead of reading all this, you can just look at this here. And this is what they're doing research in, how to prevent and how to protect. That is the issue here. And the new research centers you have here, they are around the world, as you can see. Some really, really capable people. So we're really looking forward to work with Edinburgh Bath. That's going to be very, very good. And here you have the research centers. And then on the right side here, you'll see that you have international federations. And all the international federations do have medical teams as well. So together, we are trying to make these guys become a little bit more scientific. So they do a little bit more research, they put more resources into research on how to prevent these things from happening. So far, it's been mostly our research center and the IOC except for FIFA, not many others have done much. World Rugby has done a lot. I know they have funded BOP quite a bit, but most of the international federations have not prioritized this type of work. This is the research centers last year. Every year we meet for 3 days to discuss and present and make plans for the new studies we are going to do. This is the one we had in Luxembourg last year. Now, in 2009, this was Jacques Rogge. Jacques Rogge was an orthopedic surgeon, but also the president of the IOC at that time. And he made a deal with BJSM. BJSM is, as you know, this paper, this publication. They give out 24 issues a year. 4 of those issues are run by us. That's where we present the data and the publications on how to prevent or how to protect the athletes. And the goal we have there is that is really to be able to have a platform for you guys to present your stuff in. That's what we have as a goal. Since we started out, we've done 58 of these, and we're very proud because the impact factor of BJSM is very high, by far the highest in sports world. So we're almost up there with big-time medical journals otherwise. So it's a very good journal. Otherwise, I'd like to show you that we are doing other events these days. In 2004, we're going to have the conference on prevention in Monaco, advanced team physician course in Colombia, South America. Here you see that these are the advanced team physician courses we've had. This course is for those of you who are doctors or physios in the National Olympic Committee or are working with youth or with Paralympics or with Olympics. This is a 3-day course with a guide to try to improve your knowledge in the field of sports medicine. This is the big time congress we have in Monaco every 4th year, and we're going to have this in March next year. This is where 2,000 researchers from around the world doing research in this field are coming to discuss. Then we have something called consensus meetings. Consensus meetings is that IOC has somebody tells us we have a big problem in this field. Can you please put 20 experts around the world together, spend 2 years reading literature, and then discuss in Lausanne, and then publish a paper regarding that. And if you look at the consensus papers we have here, so for example, the recent ones, Concussion in Sports is coming out next week, I believe, in BJSM. And REDS is something that is a big problem in high-level sports. Respiratory issues after COVID is, of course, a problem as well. And right now, last week, we did have a consensus meeting on age determination in elite Olympic sports. There are many issues on that, not the least, not so much age, not so much fractures that we think about, Andy and myself, but actually mental health in kids that take part in the Olympics, which is a major challenge, I should say. And the mental health consensus was published in BJSM, and this has led to much issues about that. You may remember the Russian figure skater who was 14 years old during Beijing and was caught in doping. She had probably not doped herself, but somebody had doped her, and she had major mental health issues in conjunction with that. So that's something we have to deal with, actually. This is Martin Schwellnus, professor in South Africa, and he leads our work on respiratory issues, primarily COVID, but now also many other things. So he is a very important guy for us. And this is the consensus meeting we had on concussion in October, where SCAT6 is coming out, and 10 different papers in BJSM mid-June on how to behave when you have these concussion issues there. So the last research is coming out there, and I think that compared to what we heard about today, it's not that different, Caroline. But there are some new things that may, at least the SCAT6 is new, so the following up of the patients is probably going to be a little bit better. We run something called IOC diplomas. So if you are a sports physician and you want to learn more. You spend 2 years on an online teaching platform with assignments and an exam, final exam, and then you get the IOC diploma in sports medicine. Same thing for physios, exactly the same thing, and then for pharmacy, and then for mental health, and also for sports safeguard. You know, sports safeguard has become very important because there's a lot of sexual harassment and other types of harassment in high-level sports, and that's something you have to. It was never a case earlier when I started up, but it's been, over the last few years, it's been really a major challenge in the IOC. Then we do give out grants, research grants. Just had an application for it right now, and these are the ones we gave out last year. We usually give out about 100,000 US dollars or pounds, and there you can see from various parts of the world and various items. And since 2009, we've been doing this, and I think that's quite helpful for many research groups. So I want to end this by showing you this one, because I think that sports injuries and illnesses and also mental health issues are still a significant concern, probably bigger than it was when I started out in 2007. The good thing is that we now have much material so that we can actually mitigate some of this. We will not get them to disappear. The rugby issues in concussion will probably be there. The rugby issue in hockey has been diminished in kids, but it's still a big issue in adults. And as Debbie was showing you, musculoskeletal diseases are still a big problem in Olympic athletes. They live longer. They are probably happier based on scores that we've done with them. They have less heart disease, less respiratory disease, less cancer, but much more musculoskeletal problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, Lars, Debbie. We've time just for a couple of questions before wrapping up for the day. If you want to ask any of the guys a question, just pop your hand up. There we go. We've got one just at the back there, Ian or Patrick. We'll maybe take two just for time. I know we've had a great day today.
Yeah,
oh, there we go.
A question for Lars, actually. When you showed the data about incidents of injury and illness at the Olympics, I noticed there was quite the drop in the incidence of illness at the 2016 Olympics. I was wondering if the Zika virus, if we all recall, did that have a part to play in how careful people were at the Olympics and the prevalence of illness? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Last week I was with a guy from the Orkney Islands. He spoke Norwegian English. Very difficult for me to understand. When I'm here in Edinburgh, I have sometimes difficulties in understanding everything people say.
Well, I'm English, so that doesn't help either.
All the games have had major issues.
Lars, I don't think that's working. Pop over there.
So all the games have had major issues. Zika was the one we had in Rio, and actually Zika kind of subsided before Rio started, and it did not have any impact on the issues. COVID had much less impact than we had thought. Of course, the Olympics were cancelled for 1 year, and we waited a year, and that had some impact. And when you saw the uniforms in Beijing, you understand it had a major impact, but didn't have so much impact on our statistics.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for those great talks. This question is for Lars again. Towards the end, you mentioned about safeguarding, and that had a question pop up in my head as, are there any kind of interventional things which IOC has if players face some safeguarding issues in their individual countries. I'm referring to because right now, currently in India, the wrestlers who are Olympians, who are medal winners, they are out on the streets for almost a month now protesting against their federation chief for sexual harassment, etc. I'm just curious if there is any intervention from IOC that can help such elite athletes at all, or it is just left for the federation?
So you're asking me, is there any intervention, things from the IOC to mitigate some of those issues, such as you have in India at the moment? I would say there's a very long-term one, because the Safety in Sports group have designed a system where every national team that goes to Olympics, they have 1 or 2 places for safety officers that only works on that, make sure that the sexual harassments, the harassments from coaches, so forth, is mitigated. But short term, I would say the IOC has nothing to offer in that one. I'm sorry about that, but they really don't.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more hands. I think it's been a long but a fantastic day. So for those that have registered for dinner, we'll see you later on. For those that haven't, we'll be back at 8 o'clock, bright and breezy, for another day of the same. So thank you again to our speakers.